Good afternoon, everybody. I think we should get started. I'm Narasimha Rao, a new addition to the School of Forestry here. Gives me great pleasure to welcome Skip Laitner to the seminar. Skip is a leading intellectual in the energy field, working on extremely important issues, thinking about moving us to a low-carbon society. He's been a leading intellectual for over 47 years, and had an illustrious scholarship that's over 360 articles and papers and book chapters and reports. He's held a lot of leadership positions in various roles in his past. He spent a decade at the EPA as a senior economist in technology and policy in the 90s, and won the EPA gold medal for that, I believe, and has had several other hats that he's worn since then. He's currently leading a team of consultants. It's called the Economic and Human Dimensions Research Associates, based in Tucson, Arizona. He's been the president of the Association of Environmental Studies and Sciences. He was the former director of Economic and Social Analysis at the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, the ACEEE, which is predominantly what he's known for, his work in energy efficiency. So I'm very glad to have him here, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Narasimha. A delight to be here, but I got to ask a serious question right off the bat. I see a number of you with some open computers. Are you going to be fact-checking me real time, or are you going to be taking notes? More seriously, I hope that we'll have some time for some good old-fashioned interactions and some questions. I'm going to try to keep the presentation, the formal part, relatively brief. We'll see how much that works in reality. So yes, thank you for the introduction, and I'm going to be talking about rethinking consumption, the economic imperative of greater energy resource productivity. How to think about what's the context? Well, we hear a lot about climate, we hear a lot about environmental well-being, to be sure, and they are critical issues, no question about that. But what's less appreciated and not at all wholly understood is the well-being of the economy is also equally at risk. For the very same reasons we have a climate burden, we're inefficiently using huge amounts of fossil fuels, but other resources, that is also beginning to sluggishly erode the robustness of our economy, and I will take a couple looks at that. So my suggestion is really resource consumption, greater productivity to maintain both a healthy environment, climate, but also to underpin a more sustainable, more robust economy over time. And in that regard, I want to talk about this in the spirit of, if we can draw from another school, Caltech, Richard Feynman, Nobel laureate, 1959. Richard wrote an amazing visionary talk. I suggest everybody in this room step back and read this talk. There's not a single equation in it, so if you're not a physicist, no worries. Plenty of room at the bottom. In 1959, he was imagining the possibility of storing the entire Encyclopedia Britannica on the head of a pin. In 1959, this was 30 years before IBM scientist Don Eigler learned how to manipulate cesium atoms under a microscope to spell out IBM. Stepping back and asking new questions, rearranging your thoughts to reflect opportunities you might not have imagined before. So it's very much in that same spirit. Plenty of room at the bottom, more opportunity than we imagine. The only question is, well, will we choose to move ahead in a positive direction? So in that regard, I want to start off with my favorite American philosopher. You may know him as the cartoonist for Far Side Cartoon, Gary Larson. Small differences in assumptions can lead to very big differences in outcomes. So we have a dog in the backseat of his master's car talking to his friend in the front yard, and he's saying, "Ha ha ha, Biff, guess what? After you go to the drugstore and to the post office, I'm going to the vet's to get tutored." Small differences in assumptions can have very big differences in outcomes. So how do we step back and reimagine the opportunity in hopefully a more positive sort of way? But there's an acknowledgement. And while I've benefited from a highly collegial, many interactive discussions with so many people over my own career, I really want to acknowledge an interesting gathering of people and acknowledge the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. You may have heard of IASA. Narim Saha is from there as well as teaching there. But colleagues from Japan, from the Research Institute for Innovative Technologies for the Earth. In September, we got together, 35 of us, in a deep dive 3-day discussion to really explore and take a step back. I'm reminded of, I don't know if you've heard a management consultant by the name of Warren Bennis. He wrote a book called The Unconscious Conspiracy, maybe in the early 90s. I first read it on a flight from Eugene, Oregon to Denver. Felt I needed something to read on that flight. I thought at first it was going to be another expose of something going on sinister within our economy, the unconscious conspiracy. But the subtitle was, Why Leaders Can't Lead. His thesis was a very simple one. We always let the routine drive out the non-routine. We're always more comfortable checking off a to-do list, getting our laundry done, writing that next memo, getting our paper submitted, making that conference call or phone call we have to do. We never give ourselves a chance to step back and really think and reimagine opportunities. So it's that same spirit that we had the 3-day deep dive in Nara, Japan. Nara is the old capital of Japan. That really has informed so much of my thinking since then. So it began what I would call a badly needed collaboration and dialogue that underpins a lot of my assumptions here today. I mean, I've been thinking about these things in new ways, but this really stimulated a new way to look at a number of different issues. And there were 3 big takeaways from my perspective, rethinking resource demand as we sat down those 3 days in Japan. First, there is a strong need for new metrics, new insights, images, and narratives, ways to tell the story that really help understand our social, our economic, and our environmental well-being, other than the usual metrics of GDP and income, new ways of understanding social well-being. But also a strong social and economic imperative of moving from merely things like energy efficiency and renewable resources to understand how to build greater energy and resource productivity in ways to enable a robust economy, even as we're addressing things like climate change and environmental quality. And with that, it's not merely a technology solution. Rather, it really requires the social, cultural, behavioral elements as among the key solutions to a healthy climate and a robust and sustainable economy. That's the backdrop of which a lot of my focus will be on. Because of time, I'm going to focus on number 1, primarily energy resource productivity, but maybe in the Q&A we can have some other questions about these other elements there. But let me begin and step back, and let's explore this idea of waste. I think it will surprise you, the scale of what is really moving through our economy, not in a productive way at all, but in a very wasteful end result. If we focus, as we typically do, on the waste generated in our municipal landfills, we produce per capita about 4.4 pounds per person per day, about 2 kilograms of waste that goes into the landfill. That's about 258 million tons of waste we generate through landfills. But, step back, if we add to that waste all the soil erosion that we create through our agricultural practices and our development, our highway construction and so forth, all the air pollution, all the carbon dioxide emissions, all the fecal matter from not only humans but from our cows and pigs. And in fact, from a fecal matter standpoint, when we include the production of cows and pigs and what they produce every day, we are a population not of 329 million people, but equivalent to 7 billion people. That's a huge amount of waste we produce that way. It doesn't even include the urine, doesn't include the dogs, it doesn't include the cows, or excuse me, the goats and the chickens and things like that. It's a huge amount. Adding all those up together, we go from about 2 kilograms per person per day to about 280 pounds or 129 kilograms per person per day. That is a lot of waste that creates a burden that we have to correct through things like paying for health care, emissions impact, but it also is foregone opportunity. What's wasted doesn't become useful in the way of economic well-being or social well-being. So how to translate that waste to a more productive outcome. It doesn't include water losses, mining tailings, and the many other forms of waste in our economy. So the question, are we living more by waste than real ingenuity? That's a hard question, but solving that question can help both on the climate environment, even as we tackle then a sustainable economy over the long haul. So more broadly, how can we use those resources much more productively and drive a set of what the International Energy Agency and other colleagues are calling now multiple benefits, whether jobs, whether healthier communities, as well as reduction in energy costs and material costs? I think the answer is yes, if we understand that huge opportunity. And let me offer this emerging thought experiment. The first time I've presented this, so I'd love to get some feedback. But to put waste in context, the scale of the human activity globally, I'm going to use real GDP. This is the amount of capital, labor, materials, energy in real dollar terms over years as a proxy for the material flows. It's not a perfect element at all, but we don't have very good data in this regard over time. So real GDP, meaning constant dollars, as a proxy for the amount of volume of resources necessary to support the global economy. And if we might imagine this square up here as the 1950 global economy, in US dollars, it's probably on the order of about $10 trillion in 1950. Now, we tripled the population since 1950. We roughly increased per capita GDP by about 4.5 times, so that by the year 2018, that 10 trillion has become more like 136 trillion dollars, 13 times bigger. We think that's a good thing. But if we then step back and say cumulative, that whole production of resources used, consumed, and waste generation over time, the cumulative impact of the global economy, 1950, each of the years through the year 2018, 350 times the 1950 magnitude of economic well-being or economic activity at that point in time. That is a lot of material that's beginning to shift a lot of environmental quality and have effect in things like climate change. But even worse, if we imagine that through the year 2050, with current projections from the International Energy Agency and others, that volume may be 1,000 times bigger than 1950 scale of economic activity. Example, that cumulative total would equal to about 1.6 trillion tons of carbon equivalent. We took all the energy and converted it into heat equivalents we call coal, 1.6 trillion tons of coal equivalent over that period of time. 80% of it is wasted. It becomes greenhouse gases, it becomes air pollution, it becomes toxic minerals that from ash, from burning of coal, for example, a huge problem, a huge burden, one that I think we can improve upon. So again, asking the question, living more by waste than ingenuity? I think the answer is yes, but that also speaks to huge opportunities. And in fact, what I'm suggesting is maybe we really do need to reinvent the wheel, take a different approach than what we've typically now been practicing. In the 1970s, Annandale, Virginia, teenager Frank Nasworthy actually did reinvent the wheel, and it revolutionized skateboarding. His idea, instead of steel wheels, we'll use polyurethane as a substitute, and you now know what that does in terms of ability for both skating and skateboarding. It absolutely revolutionized the wheel at that point in time. But that was yesterday. Today, Goodyear is once again trying to reinvent the wheel, and if they're successful, it may eliminate the need for axles on cars because the wheel will be a 360-degree sphere. held in place by magnets, you no longer need an axle, so you don't have to parallel park in the ways that we imagined before, and it might even create a more frictionless movement forward. The point here is, yes, sometimes we actually do need to reinvent the wheel if we really want to move things ahead in a positive fashion. With that said, reinventing the wheel, I want to take now 3 different looks at the U.S. economy to put that in perspective, to suggest to you how we may be operating less than on a sustainable platform. And what I'm going to start off with is U.S. trends in the United States, real GDP per capita. It's a proxy for, you could call it income, you could call it productivity of the economy. And I'm going to look at the years basically 1950 through 2018, how real per capita GDP has moved with 2 inflection points. 1973, the oil embargo year, 73, 74, 2007, when we had the recession from the financial markets and the like. Now, if we look at that over time, we see that, yeah, there's been a pretty nice steady increase in per capita GDP, and we think, that looks interesting. But if we then take a look at how we would have continued from 1973, over the years 1970 or 1950 to 1973, and continued that trend, instead of under $60,000 per capita GDP, real terms, we might be closer to 80,000. And then again, if we look at the inflection of 2007, had we continued the trend from 1973 to 2007, we might still be above 60,000 instead of somewhere closer down to about $55,000, $56,000 per capita. Something is beginning to slide away. We haven't been paying attention to that in any real detail. So my question is, what might this chart say about our long-term social and economic well-being? Doesn't seem like a lot, but a 0.5% change in GDP could mean an economy that is $5 trillion smaller by the year 2050. $5 trillion less available in the way of resources for education, less available in the way of health care and other opportunities. So we're beginning to see a slipping away, one that we need to pay attention to. And more critically, how might the inefficient use of energy and other resources account for that lagging economic robustness, especially into the future? The next look at the economy, I'm going from growth trends of per capita GDP. I call it my Truman to Trump chart. Now, I know that you cannot attribute to any president either the cause or the problem associated with their administration, but in today's political world, I thought it might be an interesting comparison in 2 different ways. So I'm now looking at presidential growth trends by term of office. So beginning with Harry Truman here in the 40s and 50s, Eisenhower, Kennedy, all the way to Bush 1, Clinton, Bush 2, Obama, and President Trump. But looking out to the year 2050, what is beginning to happen? You'll notice immediately a couple things. I'm going to highlight 2 of them right away. The average growth of the Democratic presidential terms was 2.6% per capita change per year. The GOP only 1.6%. Now, again, I can't attribute any presidential term to any particular outcome, but it begins to help us see that things may not be what they appear to be or how we're talking about it in a public debate dialogue. But more critically, note the steady decline in the per capita GDP. We're looking now at forecasters out to 2050, whether the World Bank, whether the IMF, others, per capita GDP 1.2% down to 0.8% per year, compared to 2.5% to 2.6% as the Democratic terms have done. That means a weaker economy. Again, that means less money available for things like education, healthcare, climate solutions, and the like. My biggest worry is that's going to continue the unraveling of our democracy. We're going to be focusing more tribal than communal, and when there are good solutions to implement, we're going to be too busy fighting each other rather than moving ahead to understand the opportunity that benefits us as a nation more broadly. And how might inefficiencies that I've described further impact that well-being? So what might constitute what I call energy and resource productivity? There are 3 key elements, and I'll show you another graph in just a moment, but to explain this. First things, yes, end-use efficiency. This building is a good example of it. Platinum LEED certified building, huge efficiency, the lighting, the way we use water, things like that. End-use efficiency is a critical step, making sure we have more efficient air conditioning, better lighting, better machines operating within the building. But a second and a surprising one, I would argue, a big efficiency gain is moving towards renewables. It turns out that the United States uses about 3 units of energy to produce a kilowatt hour of electricity for every value that kilowatt hour has as we pull the electricity out of the wall socket. 3 to 1. In other words, we're using so much primary energy to generate a very small amount of electricity. What we waste in the production of electricity in this country is more than Japan uses to power its entire economy. It's huge. So the more we move to renewables, instead of a 3 to 1 ratio we typically have now, we're going to move closer to 1 to 1. We're going to reduce energy needs in a very big way. That's a critical step forward, I think. So adding efficiency together with renewables as a revitalized efficiency strategy would be very big. But then finally, much greater levels of what I call resource productivity. That includes better use of capital. For example, we now have servers that might be using perhaps 15 to 25% of their capacity. We have cars that sit idle 96% of the time. We have trucks that have empty backhauls 40% of the time. A lot of unnecessary capital that also requires energy to support, to provide and to maintain. But then we add in materials, water, food, and especially energy. So those 3 things together add up to what I call resource productivity. And the question is how all of this might impact our social economic well-being. I saw a hand. I'll take that just after this next graph right here. So let me highlight, with that backdrop in mind, the connection between U.S. productivity, energy productivity as I've described it, end-use efficiency, greater renewables, better utilization of capital and other resources to reduce energy needs over the period 1950 to 2018. And on the horizontal axis, I'm looking at energy productivity. How many dollars of GDP per primary unit of energy are we producing? The y-axis, the vertical axis, per capita income in the U.S. So we can see in 1950, just a little bit over $60 of GDP per million BTUs of energy. Million BTU, about 8 gallons of gasoline, about just under 300 kilowatt hours equivalent. So 300 kilowatt hours, we're getting about $60 of GDP, income per capita about $10,000, all in constant terms. Coming out of World War II, as our economy began shifting away from manufacturing into services, and as the financial sector began taking hold, we saw some movement around there, but still the trend, particularly in the 80s, as we became more productive in the use of energy, our income per capita began going up, and that says to us maybe we need to pay attention to this resource productivity in new ways than we've imagined. So given the full evidence, I'm suggesting any thoughtful review would highlight the social economic imperative of much greater levels of energy resource productivity if we want to maintain a robust, a sustainable economy. But notice, the returns are diminishing. We need to bring in a new infrastructure, a new way of revitalizing the use of resources. So what we saw here going up like this is now beginning to flatten out, and it's going to be harder and harder under a business as usual approach to generate greater energy productivity and to support greater per capita income, if indeed that's a goal that we want to aspire to. So yes, I saw a question here.
I just wanted to clarify, I'm sorry to interrupt, but is the part that you said on energy productivity simply the thermodynamic, most of the thermodynamic losses from fossil fuels?
Energy productivity is total primary energy used, well beyond the exergy, the high quality energy necessary to provide the actual work. So it's total primary energy. But you raise a good point, because as you'll see in a minute here, thinking about what we have in the way of resource efficiency or energy efficiency, the global economy, this economy, is only about 16% efficient, taking energy and converting it to work. Work meaning providing materials and getting to the places we need. So it's primary energy writ large, but that gives us a huge opportunity. Does that help explain?
A large chunk of that, the conversion of primary energy to end-use energy is thermodynamic.
A lot of thermodynamic losses. You're exactly right. Over 80%, in fact, both globally and in the U.S. So the presumption we need to overcome at the same time, we have people saying, well, what if it's a big hoax? What if climate is not real? We create a better world for nothing. This is a cartoon from about 10 years ago, USA Today, on the climate summit. And here are all these huge opportunities, and we've got people saying, what if climate's a hoax? We've got to reimagine, tell new stories, revitalize the narrative in ways that help people move ahead towards its larger outcomes rather than necessarily worry about whether climate's a hoax or not. That's a difficult issue. And my colleague Jeff Luke, who passed away a few years ago from lung cancer, unfortunately, wrote a very interesting book in 1998, Catalytic Leadership Strategies for an Interconnected World. And he noted individuals have a natural tendency to choose from what he called an impoverished option bag. Cognitive research, he suggested, in problem solving show that we generate only about 30% of the total number of potential solutions on average, but we also, at the same time, miss 70-80% of the potential high-quality alternatives. It's his emphasis in the original, an impoverished option bag. We tend to gravitate to things we're familiar with without looking at the larger opportunity and imagining how to move forward. So with that in mind, I want to take another look, explore the opportunity, the scale, and the speed of the necessary effort that we have to imagine here before us in the next few years. And just for a thought experiment here, imagine we agree that there is some level of performance we think is important for the economy, whether it's in energy, whether it's welfare, social well-being, per capita income, whatever we want to imagine. But we know we've got to get up here. The bad news from my perspective is that business as usual is only going to get us about 60% of the way there, something on that order. And why do I have a downward trend here? Because we tend to have policies that focus on one out point, not realizing that we've got to maintain year after year after year. And even if we achieve here, unless we revitalize and maintain and move forward, we're going to start creating a drag yet again. But then what happens if we move from business as usual, kick it up to what I call an almost there economy using climate-based policies? We may get 80% of the way there. To go the 100% and to rise above that, we need to be thinking about how to engage energy resource productivity together with social market reforms that engage in innovations and scenarios over time. It requires a larger effort in a multi-purpose sort of way. And a real need to act, as I call, at scale and what I call in climate time. Climate time means, as you've been following the IPCC report, the 1.5 degree report, we've got about 12 years or less to get 40 to 50% reductions in emissions. That scale of effort in climate time is what's necessary. To take a step back, reimagine, and think how we might be able to engage in new ways. But here's the key insight from my perspective. The energy efficiency resource, I'm arguing, is much, much bigger than we've ever imagined. I want to go through a bit of history here. So I'm going to look at the years 1970 to the year 2050. And I'm looking at how much energy we're using, 40 quads of energy up to 160 quads at some point in time. This is primary energy. The U.S. is now using just a little bit under 100 quads of energy. Quad is enough energy to heat maybe provide energy for about 5 million homes, just to give you a sense. We're using about 100 quads now, just under. But in the 1970s, 1980s, people like me, when I began my career, began suggesting that we're going to probably need to move from about 80 quads of energy in the year 1980 to about 150 quads of energy by the year 2000. They said a supply focus. In order to maintain a wealthy, a robust economy, we had to absolutely nearly double our energy consumption. At the same time, there was an interesting report published in 1980 by colleagues at the Department of Energy, their so-called policy analysis office at that time. And I've complemented that with a study we did in 2012 to show that we could imagine a low energy future, substantially lower energy future than we imagine if we take only a supply side focus. The interesting point is that 1980 economists, policy wonks are saying, that's crazy, that's beyond the pale. We can't even begin to do something like that. Engineering alone, the cost would be prohibitive. We cannot do something like that. And actually, let's look at what happened with actual historical consumption. The actual historical consumption patterned much closer to what we once thought was beyond the pale because we began taking actions. We began embracing policies, fuel economy standards, appliance efficiency standards, other things like that, innovations in the market creeping in so that instead of this path here, we actually began moving like this. That prompted my colleagues at the Energy Information Administration. Every year they publish what they call the Annual Energy Outlook, to forecast to some point in time what the U.S. economy might need in the way of energy. In their 2005 forecast, they said, well, maybe we don't need quite so much. And they began moving downward so that instead of 150 quads by the year 2000, they said, we could imagine 125 quads by the year 2025. We began adjusting our thinking and seeing new opportunities. The most recent forecast, the Annual Energy Outlook 2019, says, oh, even a much flatter opportunity emerging because we are taking advantage of innovations and we're beginning to enact policies and see new ways of doing things. But that still leaves a gap. The argument, and many studies coming out suggesting that enabled by information communication technologies, putting together new materials, new designs, new technologies coming forward, new ways of doing business, and innovative behaviors could indeed get us down to below where we are today, what we once thought was beyond the pale. But critical to drive that, smart policies and productive investments. How can we move in that direction to take advantage of that kind of an opportunity? More by waste than ingenuity. Again, the U.S. is about 16%, the global economy, about 16% energy efficient. The amount of energy actually used to transform matter into the desired goods and services, 16% of it is used, 84% wasted. But we're so used to that waste that I'm arguing that we pre-screen, we filter, we have a limited sense of how much efficiency might actually be there. It's not until we take that step back and ask better questions, both social questions, cultural questions, technology, system dynamic questions, and we begin to see whole new opportunities unfold. So exploring the full energy efficiency potential would be, at a global scale, something like 900 billion barrels of oil equivalent. If we take all those energies saved and convert them to oil equivalents, 900 billion barrels for the global economy by the year through the year 2000, enough to reduce total energy consumption by 40%. And that kind of an impact has the prospect for a more robust, a much more resilient, and a much more sustainable economy over time, if we step back and, again, ask questions. So what is the final thought experiment? 1992 was the Rio Summit. Maybe some of you have heard of the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. It was also the year the IPCC, the International Panel on Climate Change, was formed, the United Framework Convention on Climate Change, 1992. Since 1992, the U.S. has averaged about 1.9% energy efficiency through last year. And we've actually hit 3% efficiency improvements 7 times out of those 27 years. So we have hit a good target. So let me ask, what is $4,098,331,044,116? It's my working estimate. Admittedly, it's not a precise number, but it gives you a sense of magnitude. My working estimate of the cumulative lost energy bill savings in the U.S. economy since the 1992 Rio Summit by not adopting the smart energy policies we did then, averaging 3% productivity a year. So taking the difference, roughly the scale of the economy, the average of 1.9%, instead looking at 3%, we've lost $4 trillion cumulative over that period of time. Even if we then say, but you had to pay for it, that would probably reduce us to about $2.5 trillion net benefit, let alone the ability to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and other waste throughout the economy. Lost opportunity. Opportunity cost, because we made the wrong decisions, we've lost this kind of magnitude of benefit over time. And that was as of noon today. I've got a program that'll calculate it minute by minute if we wanted to do that. And given that, all of this context, the huge scale of waste, the need to step back and ask questions, the need to engage not only technology solutions, but also in terms of new markets, new arrangements of how we get the work done, how we encourage innovation. Perhaps the ultimate energy efficiency resource among our colleagues. Recalling the comment of 20th century UK essayist Lionel Strachey, he once remarked, he said, Americans, I'm going to take a step back and say, too many people think, or too many people guess, because they're in too big a hurry to think. Part of the difficulty. Or Jerry Hirschberg, who was the founder and former CEO of Nissan Design, noted, creativity is not an escape from disciplined thinking, it's an escape with disciplined thinking. Or as Henry Ford said in the 1920s, thinking is the hardest work there is, which is the probable reason why so few people engage in it. The need to step back, reimagine, open up our sense of what the opportunities really could look like if we ask better questions. Or again, Gary Larson, we've got a couple of spiders on the playground who've just woven a web across the bottom of the slide. With apologies to parents, I'm one myself, but they say, if we pull this off, we'll eat like kings. Or as Maynard Keynes said in the foreword to his book, The General Theory in the 30s, the difficulty lies not with the new ideas, but in escaping the old ones. And with that, I wish us all success and happy to take some questions. Thank you very much. Questions, comments, observations? You've got a microphone coming up here.
Thank you. When you showed that graph about the U.S. energy consumption over time and the various forecasts, does that account for energy used in transportation of goods and also the embedded energy or the cost of manufacturing goods abroad? Because otherwise, I would imagine a lot of that gain is actually from sort of exporting the manufacturing to Asia, a lot of the transportation, international marine transport not being accounted for, rather than technological innovation, improving that.
It includes all primary forms of energy, whether transportation, industrial, building, residential, electricity production. But you're right, it doesn't include the imported energy associated with the goods we buy, but that is a relatively small part of the total picture. The larger story is that how we once thought it was an absolute supply solution that we had to focus on, as opposed to engaging in more productive uses of energy over time, and that's how you saw those change. We actually did take some steps to improve performance of energy, which have brought the consumption down. And even if we then do ship some of our production overseas one way or another, to Mexico, to Japan, wherever it may be, China, that amount of energy embodied is still going to be a small part because even they can take steps to reduce their energy needs as well. So on average, we can see globally about 40% less energy required, whether the US, whether Russia, whether China, if we work together in a collaborative way to get the job done. But an important question.
The graph that you showed with the inflection points, the graph you showed with the inflection points in 1973 and 2008, and then you kind of extrapolate forward, it seems like you're presuming that the growth that occurs before that is real and healthy and good, whereas, if you look at the 2008 data and the projection after it, aren't you kind of projecting off of like the housing bubble and stuff like that? So it's like unrealistic?
Good comment. What it's intended to show is that if you look at a graph just as one continuous line that's got some up and downs, you may be missing other problems or other weakening within the economy. And the intent there is to show, in the case of 1973-74, the oil embargo, looking from 1950 to 73, had we continued those trends, absent other surprises or other shocks or other difficulties, whether the environmental waste would have built up and prevented us from moving ahead. Yes, the point is to show that the trends are beginning to shift in subtle ways, not that we necessarily want that kind of growth. Maybe we need to focus more on social welfare, social well-being, economic well-being in the larger sense rather than pure growth, but it's slowly eroding out from under us, and that's what that's really intended to show. Take a step back and look at what might have been, and then to begin asking questions like you're asking, is there a better way we could imagine that future moving forward?
Thanks. You mentioned other ways to measure human welfare other than GDP. What could those be and how could we implement them?
Well, everything from how happy we feel as a society. I did a study back in 1990s taking a look at how much we were, our infant mortality rate, our reading capability, things like that, tracking with energy, and found that using more energy didn't bring us any higher satisfaction with regard to things like health, welfare, ability to educate and read and things like that. There is, you've probably heard of the happiness index as an example. There needs to be a good job to really engage and tell those metrics in ways that create a new narrative that people can understand as the resource consumption enables or weakens that ability. There's a lot more work that needs to be done. And notice I cheated in that I said we need these new social metrics, but I relied on the GDP because that's what I know. But even with that story, it looks like there's a slow erosion of well-being, which can only create, I think, even greater tension or uncertainty or frustration among people. But there's some good work that could be done by some promising PhD students that would help tease that out. And Dr. Rao is working on some of these very indicators. I think that's an important way forward. One of the reasons I'm delighted to be here is to engage in that conversation. So I cheated, I admit, but the picture is still fairly important to see.
Thank you.
I really enjoyed your talk, and we have a lot of industrial ecologists here who work in this space a great deal. How about all the industrial ecologists raise their hand? Lots of you, yeah. Okay, so.
And I've published in your Journal of Industrial Ecology a couple articles.
And there's the editor-in-chief.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so what I wanted to say is, and this is sort of depressive and post your talk, but I would like to get your take on it. You know, if we assume a gigantic Jevons paradox on the $4 trillion that you would have liked to put back into the economy for education and health, and we really use it to build like the biggest wall ever between here and Mexico and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we completely block out those harmful and nefarious Central American countries and so forth. You know, the Green New Deal at least tried to do both sides, kinda, right?
Right.
And so you're telling us what we could have on the resource side, resource as in dollars. What could we do on the other end to avoid the wrong rebound?
Good comment. Yes, all it is mapping out the opportunity, and then how we choose to engage that opportunity and then distribute the benefits of that opportunity. Huge policy questions, huge program questions that have to be addressed. And I think that's part of the dialogue we have to have. So $4 trillion over 27 years, that's the aggregate, not any single year. We're now just over $1 trillion a year on energy expenditures as it is. But what we choose to do with it, how much do we put into better education? I think we're underfunding all kinds of research and innovations at this point in time. The school systems need much better support, all the way down to the primary education level and upwards. We need a lot more in the way of really understanding healthcare, both as we save money because we got better healthcare problems, but as we, as an aging population, as we have growing burdens from the environment, from pollution, things like that. How we choose to distribute those is going to be, I think, an important national dialogue that we need to bring to bear. My hope is that if people understand the opportunity, they're more willing to engage in the dialogue than it must necessarily be undertaken. That's an unsatisfactory answer because it does require exactly that, much more in the way of dialogue and discussion. Yeah, Matt.
Skip, thanks for the talk. I'm inspired to go back and think harder, more creatively and more imaginatively. But when I do, the one thing that I'm sort of getting stuck on is that sort of implementing these things that we think up and that we imagine and diffusing throughout the economy is actually costly. So the numbers that you show about the savings and the bottom of the iceberg there, as if like if we just come up with the ideas, we get all these benefits. But if all of a sudden we come up with ideas for more efficient lights, we actually have to buy the new lights.
That's
we
right.
have to do the R&D. So isn't there an important category here missing of how much it costs to innovate these things, diffuse them before we can actually get to all the benefits that you're talking about?
You're right, and I did a report. There's a group in Paris, the International Partnership for Energy Efficiency Cooperation, IPEC. You can think of them as basically a service-based organization that supports the G20 energy ministries, and they asked me to address that very question. In order to drive these results, what are the policy, what are the program costs in addition to the investment costs? It's what I call what magnitude of purposeful effort. What is it that we need to do to train workers in new skills? What is it we need to do to evaluate the opportunity? What is it we need to do to engage and negotiate those opportunities? What is it we need to do to create new financial mechanisms that enable the productive investment to actually unfold in a positive way? What I found is that over time, we needed to think about today for every $100 of investment in whatever technology, whether it's renewable or efficiency, we needed about $20 of productive investment. But as we then learned that $20 by 2050 might be reduced down to 8 or 10% per $100. In other words, as we learn and as we become more acculturated to thinking new ways, that opportunity begins to unfold. And I'll give you an example. I was talking about this morning. In San Diego County, we've got management and labor working together in some new ways. Management is the National Electrical Contractors Association, San Diego County. Labor is the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. They jointly own a 4-year training facility to teach electrical workers, to give them a decent living wage, $15 an hour now, but rising over time, to train them in the skills they need. And they jointly operate it, jointly own it, and on that facility in San Diego is a 90 kilowatt PV system that they use to train people in introducing these technologies, in maintaining and designing and operating these technologies. That's part of the effort you're talking about. And there are more and more bits of work being done to outline, again, what I call that purposeful effort, the array of programs, the array of education, the array of research, the array of costs associated with policies and so forth. That then drives a more optimal investment, take advantage of the magnitude I've been talking about, the $4 trillion. My working estimate of that $4 trillion is anywhere from $1.5 to $2.5 trillion, interest payments, education, all those costs together. So we would have a net of maybe 1.5 to 2.5 benefit after that's paid for. But there needs to be more work done, exactly asking the question you are.
If I could just follow up quickly, though, isn't that difference what most of us refer to as the energy efficiency gap? And why not focus on the gap instead of just the size of the benefit that you could get? It just seems like then you debate, like, are these economically efficient, or the payback periods of these investments? It just seems like you're highlighting the big benefit that you get when just ignoring the cost side.
I'm not ignoring the costs. You know, you can only cover so much ground in 30 minutes of discussion. But you're exactly right. We need more discussion, and the more people understand the huge opportunity that's there, the more likely they're going to be willing to engage in that discussion. And we can, through programs that you teach, you know, courses you teach here at Yale, other things, we need to begin teasing those out. We don't have a lot of choice, as a number of my colleagues, and I'm sure you probably agree. There is no plan B. We've got to move forward. We've got 10 years to achieve a huge reduction. Even as we're teaching ourselves, we've got to begin moving on it. And we've got to have a real-time interaction that validates and tries something new as we learn, as we go along. It's going to be a hard problem. But I agree with you. And I could engage much more if we had the time to do so. I'd be happy to do that.
Thanks for this perspective. And I'm wondering what you see as maybe one of the biggest challenges to achieving greater resource productivity, whether it's on the political or like behavioral failure issue, or on the technology side, and a couple of thoughts you have on some key innovations or policies that could help us realize these benefits.
When I'm asked that question, I almost always begin with the first item is for helping people understand both the imperative and the opportunity. There is not a national perspective that really addresses that we've got 12 years to get a huge reduction, and no agreement in that regard with regard to greenhouse gas emissions. Nor is there a sense that the opportunities are there if we choose to take advantage of them. How to do that? We've got senators right now running against the new Green Deal and saying, we need a 5-year moonshot investment in R&D, not realizing there are huge opportunities already there. It's more a question of deployment and making it available and helping people understand that opportunity and that very critical need. So my first answer is to imagine the imperative and the opportunity, how to do that as a body politic, as a society across the different political spectrums. That's the first step. The second then is beginning to do small things today, whether we've got a slow conversion of, say, incandescent lights into LEDs, for example, or to ramp up the Energy Star labels, to have new generation of technologies, things that we can do today, even as we begin buying ourselves. So we're doing the easy things, buying ourselves a time, we're investing in people like you, in the universities, in the laboratories, to begin bringing forward the new technologies. So we're doing the small things today that are totally undertapped. I did a study for labor group in 2012 about the fuel economy standards, the 54 miles per gallon that the president's not wanting to dismantle. We found huge opportunities with better fuel economy. We need to keep those in place and even begin accelerating automobiles, even as we then begin thinking about ride sharing or sharing of materials and resources in a new way we've never imagined. So a lot of simple things that we do today to buy ourselves the time, because those are going to have to be done anyway, and then investing in our future through education, through research and development, and allowing those new ideas to emerge under the expectation that we don't have a choice. We've absolutely got to develop these things. So that would be the 2 points I would emphasize. The need to really, as a nation, underscore the imperative and the opportunity. Number 2, then as we begin investing in the new opportunities, developing the new materials, the new technologies, taking advantage of the things we can do today that are already there. We simply haven't been deploying them to buy us the time so we can catch up with some of the new innovations that are down the road. Not a very satisfying answer, I agree, but it's absolutely the way we have to move. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I just would add, or I would like to hear your perspective. Like, do you think that the low-hanging fruit of energy efficiency has already been picked, or do you still? Like, I feel like we're shifting already. So,
I think there is plenty of low-hanging fruit left. If we just take the amount of lighting that is not yet LED alone, for example, huge number of lights can be swapped out at a very significant savings. We can begin building up our air conditioning systems to a higher efficiency performance in the market, if you will. A lot of low-hanging fruit in a lot of ways. So many buildings, a typical house has the amount of ventilation through cracks and through exposures in the ceiling that might equal a square yard of hole in the building. We can fix those. We've got a lot of low-income people that are paying very high costs for energy, but we can retrofit their homes almost immediately and scale up in ways that save them money, but then reduce the amount of total energy. So many different low-hanging fruits. The question is, how do we systematically go about going after them and making them work? Other questions at all? Anybody fact check me at all? Well, thank you. This has been great. I will be around to talk a little bit later, and welcome. Feel free to contact me if you have some ideas, you have some suggestions. I welcome the dialogue. Thank you very much. Oh. generate more waste.